Washington Journal continues.
And we welcome back Ken Blackwell to the program, a senior fellow at the Family Research Council. He's also a conservative columnist and former Ohio Secretary of State. And Mr. Blackwell, since this is our first chance to chat with you since the 2018 election, I wonder what your reading of the election was. What message did voters try to send to Washington 3 weeks ago today?
Well, I think there was a major choice before the voters, and that was, did they choose gridlock or did they want cooperation to get something done across party lines? So I think what they did was they sort of evened the playing field. We saw the Republicans take a couple of seats advance in the Senate, and the Democrats won just shy of 40 seats in the House and took over control of the House. As a consequence now, the onus is on, can the two parties find some common ground? I would hope that common ground includes criminal justice reform, making sure that we deal with the challenge of drug pricing, that we come together and figure out a way to improve, refresh our infrastructure. There's plenty of work to be done. But look, at the end of the day, I believe that the parties will in fact have to really work hard to find that common ground. Their instinct is to go into combat and to ready themselves for 2020. There's a clear message here that the American people don't want gridlock. You know, I think that what they want is clarity and cooperation. And the challenge will be will the parties hear the call, the clarion call of the voters?
We spent a lot of time on this program focusing on what the House Democratic agenda will be when they take the gavels of the various committees on Capitol Hill in the 116th Congress. But I wonder what role you see the House Republicans playing next year in the minority. How do they stay relevant? Is this a House Republican minority that is any less divided between Freedom Caucus and leadership under a minority leader, Kevin McCarthy?
Look, I think that there were moderates that lost, that if anything, there will be a clear conservative voice coming from the House of Representatives. I think the minority leader will be the megaphone for the interests and concerns and the policy initiatives of his caucus, his conference. And so I look, the Democrats have made it clear that what they're going to do is, investigate. And I think that they will probably, there's a great chance that they will overreach, much like the Republicans overreached in the late 90s. And that will come back to haunt them. I hope that there is not that overreach and that we find some common ground consistent with the interests and the advance of this nation. Look, the president had some simple objectives at the beginning of his administration: accelerate economic growth, make sure that we create an environment that would bring back $2 to $3 trillion that were parked offshore. He did that through dealing with the complicated regulatory environment. He thinned it out. He made it more coherent, more capital and investment friendly. And the other thing that he did is that he cut taxes. And so as a consequence, we've now seen that flow of capital, and we've saw accelerated economic growth and job creation. And that is important for all of us to focus on, Republicans and Democrats. There's still plenty of work to do, the infrastructure. The president also ran on making sure that our borders were secure and that we could stop the unchecked flow of folks who would do us evil and who would in fact bring not only criminal behavior through human trafficking and the flow of harmful drugs, but that he would also use the securing of the borders to underline a respect for the rule of law. Look, at the Family Research Council, we believe that in the primacy of the individual in our political system and the centrality of God in the life of this nation. There has been a clear and consistent pushing of God and faith out of the public square. And when that happens, it creates an environment for the expansion of government in our lives. What has made us unique as a country is the fact that God has been central, and as a consequence, individuals don't depend on big government, but the cradle of liberty has been the family. And so we work to make sure that we have constitutional governance, that there is an environment where people can practice their faith in the public square, and that we understand that the primacy of individual liberty really does turn on putting a harness on the reach and the scope of government. That's what we believe, that's what we work for, and I think that the president actually embraced that agenda, and therefore we are working in league with the president to create that sort of environment, that sort of opportunity for Americans and American families.
Ken Blackwell joining us until the bottom of the hour this morning on the Washington Journal, taking your calls on phone lines as usual. Democrats 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, Independents 202-748-8002. We'll get right to calls. James, Mississippi, Democrat, go ahead.
Mr. Blackwell, you seem like a man of voice of reason. I wish we had more people like you in office. But as far as Trump being down here yesterday, I live just to the north of where he was at yesterday, and I wouldn't drive down the road to even go see him anyway. But the thing about it is I just don't understand why so many people around here claim to be Christian and stuff, and I understand that, and that's great, but it seems like Trump is so against the way he acts and lies about stuff, and, it seemed like back when he was running, somebody had said something about asking for forgiveness or something, and he said he didn't have enough to ask for forgiveness for. I mean, I don't understand why or how all these people can claim to be Christian, but back somebody that seems to be in right the opposition of the way that Christianity, demands for you to live or asks for you to live or something. But anyway, Mr. Blackwell, I appreciate you being on this morning. You seem like a nice man. I wish we had more people in office like you that come together and work together with folks.
James, thanks for the call. Mr. Blackwell.
Well, look, look, we are all fallen, and we all work daily. At the Family Research Council, we start out with a daily devotion, and today we're focusing our attention on Genesis 33, and I'll let you go to your Bibles to read about that. But we go in prayer because we understand that there is often a gap in what we profess to believe and how we behave, and we ask God to put us on the straight and narrow and a path of righteousness that helps us to close that gap, to get our behavior in line with those things that we profess to believe. And all of us, every now and then fall off of that path, and we ask God for His guidance and His strength to pull us back. look, at the end of the day, the president understands that nations, profess one thing and then behave another. And what he has done is he's embraced an agenda that puts us back on a path that respects religious liberty, that respects liberty in general, respects the fact that in a capitalistic society, you need capital, and that's why he has created an environment to not only attract capital, but create jobs to put Americans back to work so they can maintain their independence. So his agenda is an agenda that I think is right on track. His embrace of a clear agenda of appointing justices to the Supreme Court and judges across the federal system that respects the fundamental fact that the Constitution puts a harness on the reach and the power of government to optimize individual liberty. And as a consequence, I think this president, as he struggles day in, day out, like we all do, to get his personal behavior to align with what he professes to believe, he has embraced a policy agenda that's in keeping with what has made the United States of America the most prosperous and the most diverse democracy in all of human history.
Just about 15 minutes left with you, Mr. Blackwell, and a lot of phone calls. Robert is next, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Republican. Go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity. Mr. Blackwell, I think that you are very much an extremist in terms of, I don't think that the African Americans who are in the Republican Party think as you do. And I will reflect on something that Goldwater once said. He said that I never want people to tell me how to live my life. And Ronald Reagan once said, yes, we want Democrats in the party to vote for us, but we don't want to elect Democrats. And I don't know, you have some very extremist views, and the people whom I know, now I'm a birthright black man as a Republican. I've been in this party all of my life, and I'm 70 years old. And so I do have grounds to stand on. I come from a state that we've always had liberal senators, from the greatest one, Senator Brock, and Howard Baker, and Lamar Alexander. And the only one we didn't have, he didn't know what he was doing, was Bob Corker. But obviously, that your pitch about the party, I think is wrong. And I think you need to go back and stay away from those evangelicals, because they're the most dangerous part of our party.
Mr. Blackwell.
Look, let me take a step back. I've had the privilege of being the mayor of my hometown. And so I have had the opportunity to walk the streets, to talk with folks, to be very much a part of their lives. But I also have been blessed to have had the opportunity to represent our nation at the United Nations as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations in charge of human rights. And so I had the opportunity to interact with representatives from 193 other nations. And I've always been clear on a couple of things. And I don't think that this is extreme, and I can bring it down to a current challenge. In the 193 nations of the United Nations, they are all defined as a nation state by their borders. Their borders define them. And as a consequence, all of those 193 nations work to control their borders. I don't think it's radical for the President of the United States to want to protect our borders. There are a lot of folks who believe in open borders, but if you embrace that thinking, that in fact undermines the notion that there is a nation state defined by concrete borders and governed by the rule of law. So where the caller thinks that that's a radical notion, he has a funny definition of radical. or radicalism. I actually think what's radical is a notion that we can have voters without borders, or we can have a nation without borders, opening ourselves up to all of the criminality and disorder of a country that is lackadaisical about its borders and the rule of law. We are the most diverse democracy in all of human history. We have had open arms for those who want to find opportunity here. But we, in fact, since the existence of our nation, we have controlled the borders, and we have determined who, in fact, comes in and can pursue citizenship and life in this country. There has not been an administration that has given in to this notion that we should, in fact, have open borders and a complete collapse of the rule of law. That's not radical. That's common sense.
As we've noted, you've served in state and public office in Ohio. Plenty of calls from Ohio for you this morning, including Tommy in Akron, a Democrat. Go ahead.
Good morning from wintry Portage Lakes, Ohio. I've been waiting a few years to talk to you, Mr. Blackwell, on a Q&A. I want to pose this question to you. I heard you quoting out of Genesis in the Old Testament. When you're at the pearly gates and St. Peter pulls out the book of life and asks you about the time where you and former Governor Bob Taft were corrupt, in fact, he's the only sitting governor ever to be indicted on a felony charge, how will you answer the corruption charges? Or will you use President Trump's mantra, it's all fake news? I'll take your answer off the call.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, sir. I think I've gone through the looking glass. I was elected by the voters of the state of Ohio for a term as treasurer and 2 terms as Secretary of State, which means that I had hit my limit. We were term limited as Secretary of State. Look, I don't know what the caller is talking about in terms of my corruption. Let me give you an idea of how things really do get turned around. I see radicals and leftists and extreme partisans say, well, Ken Blackwell in 2004 was responsible for long lines in Franklin County, which is the county where our state capital is, and that in fact was some form of voter suppression. Well, nobody ever goes to find out that the Secretary of State, they said that I did that because I misplaced or didn't place enough voting machines in certain precincts. The reality is that the Secretary of State does not make that decision. Bipartisan boards of elections make that decision. In that year, the head of the Franklin County Board of Elections was a Democrat labor leader. They made the decisions as to where those voting machines, were located. I will tell you that they didn't have a bank of voting machines. They had to make a decision based on past practices and voting populations or turnout. They did the best that they could. But this notion that all of a sudden, for convenience, that it was the Secretary of State who made that decision fits into this sort of Alice in Wonderland notion that the caller just suggested, that I was ever charged with some form of corruption. I was never charged. So the charge wasn't even there. And we had political decisions. We had political back and forth, but when you take political back and forth and you try to criminalize those differences in political points of view, that's a very, very dangerous place to go to.
I wonder what your thoughts are on the high-profile recounts in Florida and the charges of voter suppression in Georgia from the 2018 election 3 weeks ago.
Well, I think that in Florida, particularly in Broward County, there was really, really bad election administration. And there is a chronic pattern of bad election administration, and I think that has led to that particular supervisor saying that she won't run for re-election. Look, there were 65 counties in Florida that got it right. There were 2 counties that had chronic disorder and disruption, and I think that those 2 counties will be dealt with by the incoming administration. She was duly elected by the voters of her district, but I think that there will be changes that will be made. Yeah, absolutely.
Don's waiting in Dayton, Ohio, an independent. Good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Mr. Blackwell, you are still quite infamous here in Ohio, maybe not for the voting machines, but I do remember something about some thrown out ballots on inadequate paper.
No, you don't. Let's go back. That's another one of those urban myths. In the mid-90s, then Secretary of State Taft made a decision at the strong recommendation of a lot of election administrators from across the state. At that time, newspapers were running aggressively voter registration columns or forms in the newspaper. People were encouraged to tear them out, fill them out, and send them in. What the post office told then Secretary of State Taft is that you need to get a thicker stock of paper for those registrations, because when that newsprint is coming back through our mail sorters, those registrations are being destroyed. And that was in place as an administration directive when I took over as Secretary of State. What happened was, midway through the 2004 election, people came and said, look, people are not sending in these voter registrations anymore. Most of them are bringing them in by the truckloads. Therefore, we no longer need that requirement, because newspapers weren't printing the voter registration forms on newsprint. We then took a step back, changed that directive. So this whole notion that was some creation to suppress voters is, again, an urban myth. And I think that newspapers, if in fact you look at how they covered that change, they got it right. They got it right. And so, again, but this is politics, and I understand it, and I engage in it, but I will not allow urban myths to go unchecked.
Just about 5 minutes left with you. Want to get you a couple more callers. Martellus, Republican, Pasadena, California. Go ahead.
Kenny, I helped you train for the Dallas Cowboys. I lived in Cincinnati in your building, which is Martellus, and I want to tell everybody you were mayor of Cincinnati, and I feel that you're doing a great job. I'm proud of you, because you were a Democrat and they didn't run you again, and then you ran for council, and you had a bipartisan success in Cincinnati, Ohio, back in 1980 to 84, around that time. So I know you know who I am, and I'm proud of you. God bless you. And you're a remarkable man. I'm telling you, you've gone way beyond what I ever thought you or I could ever be.
Mr. Blackwell, any response?
Yeah, the love is mutual. Look, at the end of the day, I tell you, I have been blessed. When my dad came back from World War II, he came back to a city where there was a housing shortage and there were still vestiges of segregation. We lived in public housing that was about half a mile away from City Hall. But to think that I could come out of those projects, graduate from the Cincinnati public schools, go to Xavier University, and come back and be the mayor of my hometown really was a blessing. And it's an experience that I wouldn't trade for any that I've had. And like I said, I've served on international and national levels, but it's that hometown pride and that hometown connection that made public service meaningful for me and inspired me. And my family has been blessed to have its roots in Cincinnati.
Earlier in the program, you talked about how you think perhaps criminal justice reform could be a place where Republicans and Democrats can find common ground in a divided Congress. Can you talk a little bit about the First Step Act, which we've heard a lot about, and whether you're supporting that prison reform legislation?
Yes, I've worked with Jared Kushner and the White House on shaping that legislation. And again, I've worked with the Judiciary Committee and Senator Grassley on giving it shape, was very much involved in its advocacy in the House where it passed overwhelmingly. Look, we need to reform our criminal justice system at the federal level, and we need to take the lead from states like Georgia and Texas and Louisiana, where in fact they understood that the system as it was there in the case of the states and as it is presently in the case of the federal system, all too often, as opposed to being an opportunity for rehabilitation, it actually hardens criminals. And so this is a way, a common sense approach, a tested approach at the state level to make humanitarian changes to our system, to give people a real chance at getting their lives together, holding families together, and contributing to the well-being and the advancement of our communities and our nation. I'm a strong supporter of this initiative.
When are you expecting a vote in the Senate on that?
I'm hoping that they will vote on it before they recess. This thing has been kicked around and for too long, and there are 60 votes in the Senate. And Senator McConnell said if in fact there were 60 votes, he would bring it to the floor. And Senator Grassley and its bipartisan supporters have indicated and communicated to Senator McConnell that there are 60 votes ready to pass this bipartisan legislation. It will be a big feather in the cap of the president, but more importantly, it will be justice for a system badly in need of reform.
Lisa's been waiting in Indianapolis, Indiana to talk to you. Democrat, good morning.
Good morning, Stan. Mr. Blackwell, I think you're the biggest part of the problem that we have in this country. I can't buy that you actually believe that he has embraced your Christian agenda. Because if you were a true Christian, you would understand that he doesn't follow any agenda except for what's waving in the wind at the moment. You say he respects liberty for Christians, but what about liberty for the Muslims? What about liberty for the gays? What about liberty for agnostics? It's like it only embraces, you want him to only embrace you, but he is actually the president of other people in this country.
Mr. Blackwell.
Look, religious liberty is religious liberty for all. And the caller didn't demonstrate how the president's policy initiatives in any way discriminate against one religion or another. Religious liberty within the constitutional context actually knows no faith affiliation. It basically allows for religion to be practiced in the public square that respects the rights of others to practice their religions without the dogma of one religion or another trampling on those other religious expressions.
Manassas, Virginia. William, Independent, good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to continue weighing on the previous caller. I think this man is an opportunist. He used Bible and Christianity to drive his own opportunist ideas. A lot of those blacks who have used Bible or Christianity to hold office, he's one of those people, and I agree with the previous caller. If Christianity becomes, what's the difference between extremists who are being condemned to be Muslim fundamentalists and yourself who is saying evangelical Christian is the base for the foundation of this country and the Constitution? I think you are an opportunist and you should not have another chance to hold office.
Mr. Blackwell, I'll give you a chance to respond.
Well, one, I'm not looking to hold office again. I'm 71, almost 71 years old. I'm now here to work to advance various policies, and glad that I'm affiliated with a number of organizations that have allowed me to do that and to do it quite successfully. At the end of the day, I was a mentee of L.V. Booth out of Cincinnati, who was also a mentor of Martin Luther King. I was an associate of Fred Shuttlesworth, who was one of Martin Luther King's lieutenants. I worked with a lot of religious-based civil rights leaders, and they understood that the greatest threat to religious liberty was moral relativism and the demolishing of some moral absolutes. And that was the heart of what Dr. King understood, is that when you have moral absolutes that guide you, that govern, that keeps everybody within the four squares of that morality. It is when you do away with those absolutes that you in fact get, if you feel good, do it, and a total disregard for other people's right to religious expression as a way of expressing their individual commitment to the furtherance of life. So, it's great to hear that there are those who believe that my advocacy for that sort of consistency in the civil rights movement of this nation, it's fascinating. It's interesting to hear those arguments, but I won't be deterred by them, just as the Family Research Council won't be deterred. We are a Christian-based organization, but we respect the beliefs or the right of others to believe their particular religious beliefs.
By the way, it's frc.org if viewers want to check it out. I want to give you a chance to chat with Rihanna in Greensburg, Kentucky, Republican. Go ahead.
Hi. This is just an FYI. A guy called in the other day about the 1960s and what he forgot to call the program he was talking about, the Bracero program. And it was migration in, migration out. The guys would come to work seasonally, take their money, go back home. And it helped out their country. Anyway, I traveled with my husband, my ex-husband, in the 1990s. This is a personal story. And we went to South Mexico. So we wrote, and he spoke fluid Spanish. And so we get on the buses and travel, and he could interact with the people. I couldn't, but he could interact with the people. He was Asian. And he could speak their language, and he was learning the Indian languages. Anyway, when we got to the hotel, I would say, are they really saying what I think they're saying? And he was saying, yeah. They were saying, Norte Americanos estupidos. And I said, were they really calling us stupid? He said, yeah. He said, they said, Norte Americanos estupidos. They give away their country, and we take it. That's what they were telling him. And these were guys that were talking about how they would chain migrate up through the lines. And just an FYI to everybody, watch the knives. Very good with knives.
Mr. Blackwell.
I worked within the United Nations framework with 193 other nation states. They all were defined by their borders and the rules that govern life, civic life within those borders. Any notion that we should be borderless is a notion that really isn't worth giving a lot of time to. Let me just say that again. She personalized something. Let me just say that I had a great uncle. His name was D. Hart Hubbard, and he was the first Black American to win an Olympic gold medal an individual gold medal in track and field, and he did it in the 1924 Paris Games. In 1924, he was to run against Eric Liddell in the 100 and high hurdles, and he was to compete in the long jump. He eventually won. He set the world record in the long jump and won the gold medal. But when he got to Paris in 1924, he was told that the 100 and the high hurdles were white-only events, and he couldn't compete. But he won his gold medal. When he came home, he said he told my mother's generation that God had blessed him to put in front of him the example of Eric Liddell. And he said, that Eric Liddell showed that more important than winning a gold medal or setting a world record was fidelity to his faith. And so that became a watchword in a term in our family, fidelity to faith. And I would just suggest that, what I do on a day-to-day basis, what I do within the context of the Family Research Council reflects a fidelity to my faith. Nothing is more important to me than that fidelity, because that fidelity defines who I am and what my agenda is and what other agendas I will join.
Ken Blackwell serves as Senior Fellow for Human Rights and Constitutional Governance at the Family Research Council. It's frc.org. You can also check out his columns at the Patriot Post. We always appreciate your time on the Washington Journal.
Good to be with you, sir. God bless.